All right, so 11:01, I think we'll get going here. So want to formally say welcome everybody and thanks for joining the webinar. So number 2 of 4, today we're going to talk about practicing your underwater photography while we're at home. So you should see my screen here with a little bit of a welcome. I do want to say that we're going to record this video and this webinar so that you can watch it later. We have a link higher up in the chat and we'll put that in again at the end to where you can watch this recording later on the Atlantis website. The video will be hosted on YouTube, but you can go back and watch it anytime, as well as the other webinars we're doing. So if you have questions as we get going, ask those questions because we want to make this more of a conversation than just a regular old webinar. So ask those questions in the group chat. You should see that in the Zoom menu bar under the More section. Just hit chat, you'll see the group chat, ask your questions there. My colleague and friend Ronnie is handling all the chat, so she'll record the questions and we'll do a Q&A about halfway through the webinar and we'll do another Q&A towards the end. So ask those questions, you know, there's no bad questions. We want to make sure we're all learning something here. So with that said, you know, big thanks to Atlantis for hosting these webinars. I work for Atlantis full-time, so a little bit about me. I handle West Coast sales and help with group travel on the West Coast for all the groups we have, all the dive shops, and travel agency groups that are coming to Atlantis. So I'm doing that full-time and trying to shoot photos when not doing that full-time. So it's a great combination and a good opportunity to help, one, you know, shoot locally, 2, shoot a lot of underwater photos at our resorts in the Philippines, and then 3, help teach underwater photography. So that's the goal, and hopefully we all take something away from here, because even when we're at home, we can still, there we go, shoot a lot of good photos. So the idea is to practice our photography and really work on our skills so that when we get to our dive vacation, we are ready to go. It's sort of like servicing your dive gear. You don't want to leave your dive gear unserviced and then show up on your vacation and have something break or be unserviced or unfit to dive. You want to take care of all that before so that as soon as you get to the resort, you get in the water, you're good to go, and you're enjoying your vacation that you've saved for, you planned for a long time, and you're enjoying it from dive one versus, you know, going through a lot of, you know, a lot of challenging and a lot of learning. So practicing at home is really about tuning up those photo skills and really looking for things we can shoot that will keep us in practice and very active with our photography when we get back to the resort. So you'll see here on this slide, we've got just a couple of similarities between 2 different subjects there. So, you know, we're looking for it. We're building our photo eye. What is the best way to improve my underwater photography? So I do hear that a lot. And it's a common question. And the answer is to practice. You should always have a camera in your hand and be working on the settings. I have one right here. Got another one right here. So, you know, keep them glued to your hands. I've heard stories from older photojournalists who have, you know, their hands are sore because they spent a career holding a camera in their hands. So if you're picking up your camera on your dive trip and dusting it off on your trip, charging your batteries for the first time since your last big trip when you're at the next resort, you know, you're going to have a learning curve getting back into it. So the spirit of this is to practice before the trip, practice when we're at home, so you're ready to go when you hit the water. And where do we hit the water? Now we've got this, this presentation hosted by Atlantis. So the place I want to highlight is the Philippines. So the Philippines is comprised of 7,107 islands. It's in the Indo-Pacific Ocean, and it occupies the top third of the Coral Triangle. And the Coral Triangle is the center of the ocean's biodiversity. So marine life, species biodiversity, the fish, the shrimps, the crabs, the corals, from the hard corals to the soft corals, is just off the charts. And that's what makes the Philippines such a great underwater photography destination. If you start looking at this map right here, you'll see that the Philippines has a number of different oceans around it. So the Philippine Sea, there's the Luzon Strait, the South China Sea, the Sulu Sea, the Celebes Sea. There's a lot going on there. And the confluence of all those different seas and those oceans running through all these channels into these big bays between the islands creates ideal habitat for a lot of the marine life and the photography we see in the Philippines. So you are going to have incredible, incredible macro life, incredible reef life that just loves hanging out in these areas, in these nooks and crannies, in these bays between all of the islands here in the Philippines. So really unique photo opportunities. What we're doing with Atlantis is we have our 2 different dive resorts for those that aren't familiar. So one is in Puerto Galera and one is in Dumaguete. We also have the Azores Liveaboard, which travels around the country depending on the time of the year. One of the cool things there is that the boat embarks and disembarks directly from the resort for most of the year. Tubataha is one of the exceptions. It embarks and disembarks from Puerto Princesa, but it makes it really easy for you to spend a few days at one of our resorts with Atlantis and then hop on the boat. Your gear miraculously appears on the Liveaboard. Never mind, it's the hardworking dive guides and boatmen and crew who move it, but it makes for a seamless transition from your land-based diving and photography over to your Liveaboard-based diving and photography. So as I'm looking at some of the photo skills and stuff we're doing here, talking about some of the marine life, keep in mind that all of this is, a lot of these subjects are very rare, but they're very common in the places we are diving in the Philippines with Atlantis. It's sort of the best of the country and really first-class service when you're diving in the country. And once you have all that come together, boom, you start creating the images. So that's what we're going to get into right here. Okay, and a little bit of our photography at home index. Now we want to take our photography from being a very baby, maybe it's a little Yoda, into a Jedi Master. And that's why we always want to have those cameras in our hands nonstop. We want to feel the camera, we want to know the camera. I don't know if we can be the camera, that's a little extreme. But let's talk about exposure. Let's talk about depth of field. Let's talk about building muscle memory, then autofocus and creative lighting. So we're going to spend the most focus here on exposure and maximizing our exposure, and then we'll dive into these other topics. So again, if you have questions, put those down in the comments and we'll stop after this exposure section and try and answer a few of the questions here. But I like to think of exposure as 3 distinct strategies. And when I think of these strategies, I put these strategies on top of my basic camera settings. So I will have one strategy for shooting wide angle photos with a strobe. I will have another different strategy for shooting macro with a strobe. And then I will have a third strategy when I am shooting constant light. So that can be still photos or video with a video light or a dive light, or when I'm shooting ambient light. And the reason I group those together is because it's the same mentality and it's the same type of setting selections you're going to use when you're shooting in each of those specific situations. So we'll dive through some of the basics with the exposure right now, and then we'll dive into the specific exposure strategies I use for working on these types of images. And just to back up a second and look at the big wide angle perspective, my goal with photography is always to get it right in camera, sort of have that old school mentality where you want to, 1, do the research, 2, be in the right place at the right time. There's that adage, F8 and B there. But, also create that image in camera so that ideally there's not that much post-processing you have to do. At the end of the day, photography happens in the camera and in your hands and not necessarily on the computer in Lightroom and Photoshop or other post-processing software. So that's my mentality. Obviously, you're going to be doing some post-processing. There's no way around that. But the closer you can get the photo to correct in camera, the better off you're going to be. And the more liberties you're going to have when you're editing and when you're post-processing once you've gotten the image right in camera. So we might as well do it right from the beginning just to open up all those post-processing possibilities. So this is our circle of equivalent exposures in reciprocity. So if you're very familiar with exposure, nod your head and smile, absolutely. If this is newer for you, excellent. That's one of the reasons we're covering this. So basically what we're looking at here, if you look at the left side of this chart where it says f8 on the aperture and it says 1/125th on the shutter speed, those settings will give you one exposure. Let's say you you slow down your shutter speed to 1/60th on that right-hand side, so you bump it up. To get the same exact exposure, you are going to stop down your aperture from f8 to f11. So basically, if you're changing one variable, you're going to have to change another variable to get equal exposure. Now, what that means also is if your image is underexposed, let's say you need more light in, so all you want to do is let more light into the camera by changing one variable, and that is going to let more light into the camera. So this is one of the fundamentals I like to look at when talking about exposure and how to change our exposure, because when we have a firm grasp on this and a firm understanding on exposure, we can start to troubleshoot our images, whether it's the ambient light you're seeing or a green tinting in your images, or everything's too dark, or your strobe has a hot spot. You know, understanding the basic exposure and the relationship between these exposure settings is how you're going to troubleshoot those images. You know, when you're down there, I always emphasize reviewing every image you're shooting, because as you're reviewing your images, you're able to make corrections. If you're shooting away and then going home and then looking at the images once you're out of the water, it's going to be a lot harder to troubleshoot. So we're looking at the exposure and these things from the beginning. We are troubleshooting to try to improve our images. Now, specifically underwater, I clicked something else here. There we go. Specifically underwater, we have 3 main exposure variables plus a 4th. Now, when we're topside, we will look at our ISO, our aperture, and our shutter speed to control our exposure. Those are our 3 criteria. But then underwater, or maybe in a studio with, you know, still life photography or models or something, you'll also have strobe light. But underwater, our strobes play a big factor in what we're doing here. So this is a basic chart I like to use in terms of our steps for exposure. Now, let's talk real briefly about the settings and how those settings will affect our images. Now, these settings will do the same thing on land when we're practicing at home as they will underwater. So once we get into some of these land exercises, we can start to apply some of these camera settings and play around with the different settings to see what they do and some of the effects that they have. You know, we can read as much as we want. That shutter speed will help freeze the motion in your image, but until you're out there practicing, it won't sit in and won't sit into your brain and become second nature. So you start shooting a photo of birds zooming around the yard, or your dog, or maybe it's a kid crawling around, or even someone pouring cereal from a bowl, cereal into a bowl, and you're trying to capture a sharp photo of falling flakes into a bowl. You know, whatever it might be, and you just start experimenting with shutter settings and shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and you're going to start to really understand the relationship between all of these settings. So shutter speed, that's going to freeze motion. Touched on that a second ago. A faster shutter speed means the shutter claps at a lot faster rate and freezes the motion. If the shutter speed claps at a much slower rate, by the time it starts and stops shutting, the subject will have moved slightly, creating a motion blur. So a slower shutter will be good for a time when there's not as much light entering the camera, or a faster shutter will be good when it's very, very bright because it's clapping down, less light into the camera, or when your subject is moving very, very fast. Looking at aperture, aperture controls your depth of field. So this can be called bokeh or bokeh, or a number of different pronunciations. I tend to prefer bokeh, personal preference, but it controls the amount of blurriness in the background. And that applies for your wide angle and your macro photos, basically anything you're shooting. If you have an iOS phone, an Apple phone that has portrait mode, what they're doing is creating an artificial bokeh, an artificial depth of field, by putting a mask around the person and blurring the background. So it's sort of a post-processing effect, trying to create what we can do in camera with our aperture by creating depth of field. We can also control the ambient light with our aperture. Now, the aperture is basically the hole in the camera diaphragm that lets light into the camera. So naturally, if we have a lower shutter, a lower aperture, so f22, let's say, we're gonna have a very small opening. But if we go to f2.8, we're gonna have a very wide opening, letting more light into the camera. So very little light into the camera and very large light into the camera. So the aperture does affect that ambient light as well. It starts getting a little confusing once we realize, hey, shutter speed and aperture can control ambient light, but that is why we're practicing and why we're practicing from home. ISO, this is a camera's sensitivity to light, more specifically the sensor. So ISO of film, or ISO of film, basically was the film sensitivity to light. And ISO is the equivalent for digital. So if you use a higher ISO, you move towards ISO 640, 1000, 3200. That's going to make the camera a lot more sensitive to light and let a lot more light into the camera. The one trade-off with that is that you'll get a lot more noise in the image. So for the most part with underwater photography and most photography, we want to keep the ISO down as much as possible. But we also want to use it if we need to create the proper exposure. So these are the relationships between the exposure settings that we want to practice with. I won't dive specifically into certain cases on when to do what. That's really for us to experiment, but I do have a few experiments coming up that we will talk about while we're practicing at home, just to help work on some of these skills and some of these photo fundamentals, so that we're ready for the next dive trip. So with that, I want to open it up to a couple questions. We're going to talk specifically about the three, here we go, exposure strategies next. But are there any questions now? So I'll invite Ronnie to jump on board here and see if we can answer maybe 5 questions before we move on, and then we'll do another Q&A at the end.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Brent,
I can hear you. Welcome, Ronnie.
Excellent. So I guess everybody else can hear me. So that's good. We have 4 questions, okay? And I will ask them in the order that they were asked on the chat. So the first one is from Rebecca. And the question is, what would be a basic equipment to start as an amateur in photography? What would be a basic equipment to start in an amateur photography? Excellent. That's duplicate.
Yeah, that's a fantastic. It's a fantastic question. So there are a lot of variables there in terms of what your goals are in trying to practice underwater photography. So I just actually put a whole video together with Scuba Diving Magazine, and it's on my YouTube channel and on scubadiving.com, and it goes in depth on that topic. But in short, the answer to that is you want to, 1, determine your budget, 2, determine what you plan to shoot, because different gear can be specialized towards different things. Maybe you only want to shoot macro photos. Maybe you only want to shoot wide angle videos. Maybe you're a free diver and you only want to shoot free diving or snorkeling and not deal with strobe or video lights. So there's a few basic things to consider. Maybe you're an avid land photographer and use DSLRs or high-end mirrorless and are looking to go underwater, in which case you're going to expect more from your first system underwater. There's no right and wrong in terms of what you're doing, and you can create great images with any camera. And I think that's the bottom line in a lot of the photo talks and photo instruction that I do, and especially with the talk today, what we're doing, going through some of these settings and practicing from home, is that it doesn't matter what you can get. You can have a very basic entry-level camera, you can have a GoPro, and you can still create great images. You just need to understand how to create great images and where the limitations and the pros and areas your camera excels are. So if you know that, for instance, a smaller sensor camera is going to do better in brighter light with less dynamic range, less in the scene between the dark point and the light point, you may be able to create great shots. So really, it's a personal question. And 1, check out that video and that article on scubadiving.com and Scuba Diving Magazine. 2, talk to your local underwater camera retailer and your local dive shop. I mean, these are the pros, these are the experts, and they'll be able to talk through those questions with you and move you into the best camera for you. And that goes with upgrades for anyone who's on the webinar. If you're talking about upgrading lighting, strobes, video lights, adding a second light source, adding a different lens, adding a wet lens or something like that, talk to your local expert. They deal with this all the time, and they will be able to move you in the right direction based on specifically what you want to shoot, because it is so personal.
All right, excellent. Rebecca, I hope that answers your question. We'll go into the second question. The second question is from Martin. Do you provide photography workshops in Puerto, Galera, or Darwin, and what is the cost?
So the answer to that is yes. And with Atlantis, we are very fortunate in that we actually last year was our 25th anniversary. And while I haven't been around all 25 years, I'll take full credit. But we have established a very good reputation among professional photographers, and we have a number of different photographers who visit and do photo workshops at the resorts. With Atlantis specifically, we don't have a list of those up front, which is probably something we could start putting together. But if you start searching around, there are a number of top photographers who are hosting photo workshops at both resorts. So it presents a good option. I did one there last January, and maybe looking to do one again early next year. Have not confirmed that yet, so don't want to promise anything, but we can stay in touch if you would be interested. My email should be on the confirmation you received from the webinar. We'll post it here at the end too in the group chat, and we can talk further. But year round, we have a number of different photo groups and photo workshops at both resorts and on the Azores Liveaboard. And cost is going to be totally different depending on the trip that you're doing.
Good. And so now we're back to Rebecca. What is the appropriate time to take photos at the sea?
Ooh, anytime. There is no right and wrong time. Daytime, nighttime, shallow, deep, big stuff, small stuff, it's all good. Different areas of the world will have different seasons and seasonalities. We're lucky in the Philippines that the diving is great year round. Sometimes you could have a little more rain than other times. The water temperature could change slightly, but we are diving year round. We have groups year round, so there's really no bad time. You can go out in the middle of a storm safely from a beach if you have an ocean near home and go shoot photos of waves and wind droplets and waves passing overhead. There's all kinds of stuff you can shoot in the sea.
All right, cool. And now we've got one from Bill. What ISO to start with for night photos? What will I notice with different ISOs?
So for night photos and different ISOs or ISOs, it depends exactly what you're shooting. And this is one of the reasons I didn't want to dive into specific settings too, is because everything you're shooting is going to require different specific settings. So for something at night, if you're shooting underwater macro, you're going to be using the exact same very low minimal shutter speed as shooting macro during the daytime. If you're shooting wide angle at night, now it's very dark. You're not going to get any blue-green background like you see in traditional wide angle photos. So if you are trying to light something very small in a foreground, let's call it a barrel sponge or a sea fan or a bit of reef or your dive buddy, you can still use a very low ISO and you light that whole subject with your strobes or your video light and you'll have a jet black background. If you are trying to shoot at night in shallow water, maybe 5 meters, 15 feet, and look at some of the moonlight reflecting through the water surface, then you might want to crank up that ISO basically to the limit of your camera to where you're comfortable in getting the sensitivity to light with the noise trade-off. On my 5D Mark IV and Canon full frame, that's going to be ISO 64-100 roughly, but each camera is going to be slightly different. Okay, and was that 3 or 4,
now
Ronnie?
we've got one last one last question from Alicia. How can I recreate backscatter at home to improve my skills?
Ooh, maybe grab a handful of salt and throw it into the air. Recreating backscatter. So backscatter is the particles that are in the water, and they can be caused by pieces of sand, by pieces of substrate, by organic matter, by any number of things that are in the ocean there between you and the subject. And they are caused by light reflecting off those particles. So if you're using video lights or strobes, that light is reflecting to the particle. This is our camera, this is our particle. The light comes through the water, hits the particle instead of the subject and bounces right back. Sometimes you'll see backscatter if you are swimming into the sun and you've got a lot of plankton in the water. You'll see the backscatter lit up from the sun. So in order to practice that at home, you'd really just need to create some sort of dust or dusty area. That's at the expense of your camera, maybe getting dusty or something. Really a tough thing to recreate at home, honestly. I'll get towards it at the end, but we're going to talk about creating creative lighting angles. So what I would recommend is just look at detailed strobe positioning tutorials and light positioning tutorials and work on practicing some of those techniques now so that when you're in the water working to minimize backscatter, you have a head start because you understand where your artificial light is pointing and understand the direction you can move it to minimize backscatter. So that would be my biggest suggestion. And the very last piece we're going to talk about in this presentation covers that creative lighting. So hopefully that will help answer your question, because once we understand lighting, we'll be able to master minimizing backscatter in the water. Okay, so I think that's it. Let's jump back in. Ronnie, thank you so much.
Absolutely, guys. Please keep posting your questions, and we'll have another Q&A session at the end.
Exactly. So now we're going to talk into those 3 different exposure strategies. If I can find my mouse. So let's talk wide angle first. Now, I shoot wide angle with a two-step exposure process. The first step is to expose for the ambient light. Now, wide angle images are composed of two different light sources, which is why I do a 1-2 step process. The first step is going to be ambient light. The second is going to be to fill in the foreground with strobes. So if you can see that difference there, here's my step 1, here's my step 2. Now, what I am doing is well, first of all, I am shooting in manual settings. So anytime I'm using a strobe, I really want to be in manual settings. TTL is great, it works well, but for the purpose of really understanding our camera settings, it helps drastically to be shooting in manual. So that's what I'm gonna address here. But as I'm swimming around the reef, I want to be metering the scene, and maybe I'll turn my strobes completely off, and I want to be shooting the blue water or looking at the blue water, looking at my histogram, looking at my exposure and trying to see where am I getting the nicest blue tones, where am I getting the nicest ambient light for my photo. Because keep in mind, if you point the camera, you're here, if you point it up like this, and now we're shooting up towards the sky, a turtle swimming overhead, and now we're shooting like this because a ray goes below us or a shark or something cool, we have two completely different ambient light exposures. You shoot down, you're gonna have no light in the camera. You shoot up, you'll have a lot of light in the camera. So as I'm swimming around, I'm constantly metering for the ambient light, so I'm ready to shoot. With that said, it's a great technique if you do any drift diving. So if you're drift diving, sometimes you can be moving really fast and you see this subject, maybe it's an eagle ray swimming by you into the current and it's zipping by and you're not gonna kick against the current. You're gonna have one shot to try and get it. So if you have already metered for the ambient light and you have this setting already, by the time you get to it, you drift by, snap, snap, you get your shots and hopefully you have it dialed in. So I always have my ambient light set first as step number 1 for wide angle. Then step 2, I will turn on my strobes and I will fill in the strobes. Now, I don't have to worry about the background anymore because I did that. So my camera settings are already done. Now all I'm doing is manually adjusting the strobe power to get the proper exposure. And again, you can see that in the histogram as you're reviewing your images, because you should really be reviewing your images after every single shot. If you shoot 3 photos in a row and don't change anything, I can pretty much guarantee all 3 are gonna look the same. If you shoot a photo, you review it, you make a change, and you shoot the next one, now you have a change to work with, and hopefully you improved it. If you made it worse, no problem, just compensate in the other direction with whatever you changed. So that's what we want to work with. So by breaking this down into 2 steps, it makes exposing your scene for wide angle very digestible and helps to troubleshoot. Now, sometimes if you have 2 strobes and you're just down the rabbit hole, you're having a tough time, turn off both strobes, go back to step 1, work on your ambient light, get that set correctly, get your settings dialed in, turn on 1 strobe, get that lit correctly. Okay, now you've got 1 strobe, it's great. Now turn on strobe 2 and start working on that. If you're trying to work on 3 different variables that each have their own sub variables, now you can't keep track of anything you're adjusting. So try and minimize the adjustments, because every adjustment you make after that, you're going to start making improvements. So that's for wide angle. For macro exposure, we're talking about a whole different thing. So macro exposure, we are basically exposing the entire scene with our strobe light. So we're not worried about ambient light at all, which is nice because it makes it simple in that sense. Now there are exceptions, of course. You could be shooting macro with blue backgrounds and stuff like that. Or if you have a medium field of view on a compact camera, you could get a lot of background. That's a different thing. But basically what we want to do is we want to keep the ISO minimum. Since our strobes or our video lights are so powerful, we don't need to increase the ISO to help let light into the camera. Our artificial lighting is strong enough. We want to set a fairly fast shutter speed. And what this does is it cancels out more ambient light. So if your macro photos have a greenish or bluish type tint to them, one of the most common reasons for that is your aperture, whether manually or automatic, has gone down to 4.5 or something like that. And it's letting in a lot of that tinting into your image. So speed up your shutter speed and you're gonna get a darker image, crisper image with more vibrant light from your strobes. And then also dial in that strobe power. So once you have your settings dialed in, sort of like the 1-2 step with wide angle, adjust your strobe power. You wanna start working on your depth of field first with the macro image, and then with your aperture, and then you'll come into your strobe light. And we'll dive into depth of field in just a second here. So, that's basically it. get your settings in there and work on your strobes, because your strobes are doing most of the work for these macro photos. And then number 3, so constant light exposure. And I mentioned before, but I tend to group video lights in with no lights at all. It's both constant light. And the reason for that is because it's one mentality and one settings group. So all the light is visible through your camera, and it means that you are seeing exactly what you're trying to record. You're not going to have a surprise flash from strobes that you didn't anticipate. So with that, you can even, this is the opportunity to start using more automatic settings too. So if I'm out there and I'm snorkeling with, let's say, whale sharks, I'm going to be shooting in aperture value or time value priority, shutter priority. So I have selected one of the variables for the camera and probably the ISO, but I leave one variable open and let that automatic variable change, because a camera can think far faster than I can with exposure settings as I'm swimming around and doing all of this. And that's one of the instances where you can do that. So I've completely changed what I'm recommending in terms of exposure strategy from manual with the strobes for macro and wide angle to, hey, let's use some automatic settings for the constant light again. And that is because you can see exactly what you're getting and you can make those changes up front, and then you're pretty much good to go. So that is it. Of course, you can shoot manual as well when you're talking about constant light. Now, okay, back to the title of our presentation, how to practice underwater photography at home, not underwater frogfish. If you have a frogfish at home, that's a whole different thing. We keep those in the Philippines. Okay, we still awake? We there? Normally I give a pop quiz, but I think we'll move past that. Here we go. So exercises at home. So you don't need to create the best photo. Let's not think, hey, I need to create a macro still life with dew droplets on it and interesting hued lighting that's going to win a photo contest. Don't worry about that. Just shoot whatever you have on hand. These are little pebbles I pick up when I see something cool after surfing. But look at both of these images. One was shot outdoors and one was shot indoors. Both of them are shot at an aperture of 14, so f14. And there's big differences in the shutter speed and big differences in the ISO. And the whole idea with talking about the equivalent exposures and the relationship between all these exposure settings is that you need to understand intimately how changing one exposure setting will adjust the exposure, and then how to adjust another exposure setting to adjust the exposure as well. So as you play around with this and just work through the settings, you know, who cares what you're shooting? Again, you'll really start to understand the differences in these and really start to understand the light. You know, for instance, this photo on the left was shot outside on a tripod, all ambient light. Then inside, I was shooting on the tripod and indoors was so dark. You can tell that I changed my settings to let a lot more light into the camera. I increased my ISO. I slowed down my shutter speed, but it still wasn't enough. So what I did is I just pulled my cell phone out of my pocket, turned on the little flashlight, and you can see me shining it from the right. So whatever you want to do to experiment, just start playing around, because those settings changes are going to really help work through those exposure variable challenges. In one of my videos practicing from home, I was standing at the door and basically shot a photo outside, wide angle, turned around, shot a photo inside, and racked back and forth through the settings quickly so that I could start to practice, okay, I need to be at these manual settings to shoot outdoors, these manual settings to shoot indoors. And moving through those is just such a good exercise. So highly encourage it. So now, depth of field. This is something we can really practice at home too. And had someone reach out the other day, they shot great photos of a grain of rice. So whatever you want, if you're practicing for that Shaun the Sheep nudie or some of those little flavelinas that are this big, just, you know, the size of a grain of rice, or maybe it's those little frogfish, practice working on your depth of field, because it will help your images so much. So in general, for macro, you want to use a higher aperture number. So you want to stop down, and that is going more from the smaller, the f2.8 side, all the way down to the f14, f16, f22, f32, even on an interchangeable lens camera. You want to be down in that range to create a lot more depth of field in your images. Now, this is because you're so close to a subject, you need to do that in order to create the depth of field that we want in an image. If you're shooting wide angle now, you don't need to be anywhere near f32. You want to probably be somewhere in the middle, be at, you know, f8, f5.6, f14, somewhere in that middle range depending on the specific gear you're using, and that's going to create a really nice wide angle shot. Now there's a lot of different exceptions in what you're shooting, but the idea here when we're practicing at home is to move through those aperture settings so you can really start to see what you're doing and how those changes will affect your photos. So here is an example of an underwater photo, the exact same seahorse taken a few seconds after one shot after the other, one at f2.8, one at f14. I think you guys can see the difference here. It's got the same shutter speed, but you can, one, see that a lot more ambient light was let in on f2.8 because the aperture was bigger opening, letting a lot more light in. But really look at that depth of field. On the seahorse to the right, you can see that a lot of the back of the neck is more in focus. And on the one on the left, you see a lot more bokeh. You can tell that you can barely even see the chest on the seahorse. So that's one of these differences with the depth of field and what we want to practice at home. So you can practice on your keyboard. You know, keyboard's really easy. It was right there in front of me, quite literally. It's still here in front of me right now. So you can practice that. You can even download one of the manual camera apps for your phone and practice these types of things on your phone. So again, you don't need to break out your whole camera system and everything, but start experimenting with those, some of these angles, looking at the depth of field. Here's a flower that bloomed off a cactus yesterday on our balcony. So one example, f3.5, another example, f32. And if you look at the back of the flower at f32, you can see a lot of detail there. If you look at the back of the flower at f3.5, you can see that bokeh, that out of focusness, so a very shallow depth of field. And I'm looking through these, I'm practicing these. If you get a bad photo, don't delete it. And this is the same thing underwater too. Keep those bad photos if you really are doing a practice exercise. Put those on your computer and study them. It's so easy to say, oh, bad photo, delete. But if you load those onto your computer, if you study them, if you look at the settings differences between the photo you liked and the one you didn't like, you will understand why you got the photo you liked. So it takes some extra work. It's some homework, but homework is the way you get a lot better. Here's just another example, f2.8 versus f14. So this is a cactus, and at f2.8, you can really see the out of focus and that bokeh around the edges there because the cactus, the center of it sticks up a little bit. So the rest of it is behind the top of the cactus, and that's why it's out of focus. Once we stop down to f14, we have a lot more bokeh, a lot more depth of field, and the whole scene is in focus. So you can really start to see that in this example. And here we go, practicing at home. You can start to really see some of the similarities here. And you can look for scenes that mimic some of the scenes you might shoot underwater. You can shoot large things, wide angle things. You can shoot macro things, small things, the indoors, the outdoors. But really start working all of this. Where do you put your focus point when you're composing these images? So that's a big thing too. So look at the difference between your compositions and some of the depth of field as you're shooting these. I went through the photo on the right just yesterday or Sunday when I was shooting this and was trying to determine how much depth of field do I want for the background. Now this is somewhere, I think it was around f14. So I didn't go to f32, but I also didn't go to f2.8. I figured, okay, to make this photo look somewhat like the photo on the left of the corals, I want to use this amount of depth of field. And then that was really interesting to try and make one image look like the other. So if you really want an advanced exercise for all the shooters who are a lot more experienced out there, pick some photos that you think you can recreate in your house, your apartment, your condo, outside in the yard, walking around the neighborhood, whatever it is, and just go on a hunt for those. Just try and look for those. As you start to look for scenes and images, that's the sort of thing that helps you find nudibranchs on the reef. You see those subtleties. You see something on the sand move or twitch. That's what our dive guides are using to find those subjects too. So you go out there and you practice those skills and start looking for certain compositional elements. It keeps you sharp and it helps you to find those critters when you're actually down there. And impress your guide. And when they're impressed, they're going to find even cooler stuff for you. One note on this cactus on land is you can see that the sunlight hit a lot of the background here. So as we start talking about lighting and things, what I did for one of the shots just to experiment was I took the seat cushion from outside on the balcony and I held it to block the sun. If you've ever gone by a movie set on the beach or somewhere, you'll notice the actors are standing under a big sunblock. So it looks like they're standing outside, but there's no direct sun on them. Like, how does that work? They've just blocked it and shaded it out. So I tried that on this shot. So by all means, get creative, experiment as you're going through these exercises. because, you know, the more you do that, the more you're prepared for when you get underwater. You can shoot the abstract scenes. What depth of field is going to make this photo, and I specifically remember shooting this at a number of apertures, what depth of field is going to make this one great? I wanted to see some of the coral polyps in the back, and I wanted to see some at the front. I didn't want them to be fully in focus, but I didn't want them to be too out of focus. So by knowing my settings and experimenting, I was able to find the amount of depth of field that I liked. Again, this might not be for everyone, it's personal preference, but if you find something you like, it'll really help you create the artistic image that you want to get, or even be ready when something crazy happens. So you're down there on a night dive and all of a sudden you notice a number of squid above your head. And whoa, okay, I want to shoot that. And you're just shooting the tiniest nudibranch you've ever seen, like down there. And now all of a sudden you've got this squid that's about this big against black water. Boom, 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 change all your camera settings as quick as possible. You don't want that squid to swim away, and get in there and shoot. The more you understand the depth of field, the more you practice with it, the better prepared you're going to be when you have 1.6 seconds to turn around and shoot the squid that just happened to show up in your frame. Maybe you're shooting wide angle and a shark swims by and you're just shooting close focus wide angle. Now you need to rapidly change your settings for that shark swimming by. So the more you get to know that, the more you get to know what aperture you want for a specific shot. As soon as you see it, the better. Oftentimes for my macro photography, I will set the strobe positioning and all the camera settings, flip on or off a diopter before I even move into the subject. And what that does is it makes my buddies actually like diving with me because I spend less time with the subject experimenting. You know, I'm closer to the final product I want because I've anticipated the settings, I've pre-visualized the shot, and I've moved in there versus sitting there and trying to work everything through. My dive buddy breathes in my ear, you know. So just a tip there, the more we get to know this, everyone benefits, everyone loves it. Okay, muscle memory. So this is our next topic here. And muscle memory is pretty straightforward. This is where you can be the Jedi. The faster you are in moving through your settings, the better off you're going to be in those situations I just mentioned. You're going to be able to change your settings quickly. You know, what if you turn off your camera on the safety stop, because we all like to do that, and that's when the whale shark swims by. You know, you got to be ready to fold everything out, turn it on, set the settings, and go. So how do you know you're fast? You want to be able to change those settings with your eyes closed. I've done a lot of night diving and love it, but you can't see the back of your camera. I actually turn the whole LCD display off because it's way too bright. So you just operate your camera by feel. Let's say you're moved into a macro subject and you've got your camera in front of your eye. It can be, you know, a compact, a mirrorless, a DSLR. You don't want to break your composition to come back and look at all of the settings and things and change. You know, you want to focus on getting that shot. So you want to be there and just be able to roll your wheels, change your settings, and keep shooting. So if you understand how to do that, which way to roll the dials, you're going to be able to adjust on the fly and make those changes. You want to be able to activate and move through all your essential camera functions really quickly. So shooting an image, reviewing the image on the histogram, going back to the image. Maybe it's changing custom camera settings. I have a quick function setting for back button focus on my camera. So I have that programmed into my camera, and if I haven't shot for, you know, maybe it's a couple weeks and camera's gotten dusty, I will go through that and practice changing it a few times before I'm in the water, because there are times when I want to change that setting very quickly in the menu and have that dialed in. If you're a video shooter, manual white balance is a must. Practice that. Do it 4 or 5 times. Do it with your eyes closed before you even leave on your trip. Then before you get in the water, do that again, and you're going to be ready to go the second you hit the water, and you'll be shooting good content on your first dive. So that muscle memory becomes second nature the more you do it. And use your housing as well. So your camera is slightly different from the housing. So work through the settings and understand the settings on your camera. That's ideal. But then build the muscle memory through your housing. Remember where all the buttons are and that sort of thing. Okay, and now autofocus tricks. So autofocus is big, and I put these thumbnails up. It's my video series I have on my tutorials website in the masterclass section. But autofocus is big. The more you understand autofocus, the better off you're going to be in terms of shooting some of the different subjects. So I have a 4-part series, video series online, but let's jump back into some of the problems and tips and tricks that we can practice even at home so that we're ready for the water. So the first problem is you can't focus on a macro subject. Probably all of us have seen the camera go, and the focus is hunting. It can't lock on a subject. The quick solution for that is to use a focus light. So that's number one. If you are an avid macro shooter, want to shoot macro photos, get a focus light. What that does is it brightens up the image and adds contrast, which your hybrid phase detection autofocus system will want to use to achieve focus. Also, what you can do is adjust your focus point to coach the camera into focus onto an area of high contrast. Maybe it's the edge of a white subject against the reef. Maybe it's the border of an eye pupil. Maybe it's the edge of a rhinophore. It could be anything that has high contrast, and that will help you to get your camera to focus, because your camera will want to use that contrast to focus. So if your camera's hunting and you're just on an area with, maybe it's a light yellow with a light pink with white on your subject, and there's low color contrast there, there's low exposure contrast there, your camera is going to struggle to focus in that situation. So maybe get it close by focusing on something with more contrast, and then move the camera back to that place you really want to focus there. What I like to do always is move the focus dot around and have a manual focus point. And I will put that on the area that I want to have in focus, but sometimes I'll coach the camera on the area of high contrast and then move it back, kind of the focus and recompose method. So here's another challenge. Maybe you're shooting a wide angle scene and you're shooting up towards the sun, and you've got a big sea fan right there, or a big coral, or whatever it might be. The camera's hunting specifically with a fisheye. Maybe if you have an acrylic port or an acrylic wide angle lens, maybe it's got some scratches on it. All that stuff's gonna affect the camera's ability to autofocus. Look at focusing on that high contrast area too. So use the same techniques, move off the part you really want to focus on the area of high contrast, and then come back to shoot that, to compose the image and focus on the area you really want to focus on. If you have certain mirrorless or DSLR cameras, look at setting up back button focus. Now that's a really great one. Again, full tutorial on my website on that in video, but try using back button focus, because in my mind, that is the best balance between using a manual focus and autofocus. Essentially what you're doing is using autofocus to focus, but only when you want it to do so. So you really have the best of both worlds in terms of focus, and that can really, really help in a challenging autofocus situation where you can't get the camera to lock on. So take your camera into a dark room. Maybe it's a bedroom, close the blinds. Maybe it's a bathroom where it's dark. Maybe it's at night at home, and try and focus on something and, see if you can hunt it down. Then maybe take your phone flashlight or little LED flashlight you have and shine it on there. Notice how the camera focuses right away. So play with that sort of stuff and just learn how the camera focuses, where it has good focus and where it challenges with focus, and that's going to help you a lot. Lastly, so moving subjects and subjects that are slightly out of focus. So this is where you can experiment between single and continuous autofocus drive modes. And each of those will work differently for different people and in different shooting situations. The general rule is if your subject is still, use single point autofocus. And if your subject is moving, use continuous autofocus and have to press your shutter while you're tracking the subject. And then when you shoot, your camera will shoot right away. So again, for a subject that's not moving, use single autofocus. For a subject that is moving, use continuous autofocus. Now there's a number of exceptions and things, but that's a general rule. And play around with both and see what you like and practice switching between them. And then when you're underwater, you can switch between them too. And maybe you'll find you're getting the nice, sharp in-focus image you wanted now that you're using continuous instead of single, or vice versa. So, get familiar with those autofocus modes. I'm constantly switching back and forth between both during my dives. Okay, and this is our last major topic here. Thanks for hanging in there, guys. And this is creative lighting. And this is where we can get really, really fun. Talking about things like studio photography or still life photography using artificial lights. You don't need a fancy, studio light and softbox. You can use a little flashlight. The one note is try not to shoot much with your strobes or repetitively with your strobes or any serious or powerful dive light or video light. Those are all designed to be used in the water where the water cools them down. And you could really damage those. So use a light that's versatile, that's made to be used on land is generally best. If you're firing a couple strobe shots as tests, do those few and far between, at least count to 10 and do that sort of thing. But the underwater gear is just not made to use on land. But use your light and start experimenting, shooting these studio shots and look at the angle of light. And we had a question earlier about how to practice with backscatter underwater. And this is really where you can start understanding the angle of light. You know, for this photo of the regulator here, I used that light you see there. It's a 1,000 lumen dive torch that's okay to be used on land and underwater. And I was just shining it with my hand. I actually cupped the light with my hand to create a bit of a snoot effect. So the light was in shallow, and I used my hand to create a bit of a snoot effect. And it really minimized the light into a pinpoint, and I was able to create just a hint of light on the edge of the regulator. So as you start experimenting with these angles, you can start to see, hey, this is the angle of light. This is how it affects the subject that I'm shooting. It's the exact same principle when you're talking about your video lights or your strobes underwater, or if you have a snoot for underwater use. The more you practice this on land, the more you're going to understand the angle of light and the shadows and the contrast you're creating as you get underwater. So here's another example of my rocks here, apparently my favorite rocks, shooting indoors. But look at the difference between the two here. You should be able to see the difference in the angle of light. And it's a very subtle thing, but these are the differences that can really make or break your underwater photos. Now, both of them are, you know, they're not great shots. You know, the one on the left is kind of dark. There's nothing special. The one on the right has a lot of hot light coming from the right. But just look for those subtleties as you're experimenting around. And by seeing those things, by practicing those things, you're going to really improve your skills underwater. You're going to build that eye that's going to allow you to see what you're changing underwater and get that light dialed in exactly how you want it on all of those photos. And once you have that, here you go. You will start mastering strobe positioning. So as you work on the angle of light, we have something that we call the cone of light with strobes and video lights. And to minimize backscatter, you basically want to shoot with the edge of the cone of light, and you want to light the subject without lighting any water between your camera port and the subject, or the water behind the subject to get a nice black background without backscatter. So as you work on these creative angles of light, you'll start to understand the direction of light, which will help you use the cone of light when you're positioning your strobes. Now, I know that's a bit of a stretch where you know, that's a long tail there, but it really, really helps, and really helps you work through a lot of those things. Now, once you combine practicing your depth of field with changing the settings quickly, with adding that light you're holding to get a creative light effect, now you have to change the settings again slightly. All this is going to make you a rock star with your underwater photography, because you're able to, one, pre-vision your shot, two, you're able to adjust from your basic starting point into that creative photo you want, and you're able to get those creative results. So that is basically it for this. We're going to come back to the Q&A. So I will invite Ronnie back here, and we'll jump through a few questions.
Oh my God, there are a lot of questions, and
Okay.
very specific. Some of them are very, very specific. So
Okay.
I'm going to start. Yeah, so just take your time answering those. The first one, I'm going to do them in order when they were asked. So the first one is from Paulo. And what white balance do you use with ambient and strobes?
For ambient and strobes, I use automatic white balance for basically every camera and strobe combo. One thing there is I always shoot in RAW. So definitely shoot in RAW. The nice thing there is you have a lot of flexibility, unlimited flexibility in adjusting your white balance in post. And the reason I say that is, well, we want to get it right in camera, but most cameras now will have fairly accurate white balance in their wide angle scenes when you're shooting. And if you do notice that it's a little hot or a little cool based on the way the camera metered the scene, maybe the strobes are a little warm, a little cool, or the warm strobes with your particular camera brand deliver, you know, a warm color temperature. Those are the things that you can adjust subtly in post. So I leave everything on automatic, and then if there is anything to adjust, you're making such a minimal adjustment in post, just make that in post. So that's the easiest way, and it keeps you focused on the other settings and shooting.
All right, cool. Next one is from Lloyd. Do you start strobe process at 50% power for the wide angle? Fill lighting?
That's a great question. Yeah, so the strobes are basically used as fill lighting for that subject. I tend to start about half power. Yeah, so 2 clicks back on CNC strobes is what I have. And again, I'm calling them clicks because I don't even look. I just go by clicks. 2 clicks is about half power. But that's a good starting point. From there, you can go up to 3/4 or even down a little more. You'll begin to find that you always have the same starting point, but half is a great spot to start. The other thing you can do is, when you're troubleshooting, is not just to adjust strobe power, but adjust the distance from the strobe to the subject. The light falls off exponentially. So if it's too hot, pull that strobe back slightly. If you want more strobe light, just push it forward a little bit, and you'll notice a lot of changes there without even changing the settings.
All right, and the next one is from Pam. Can you provide some tips for how to properly use a white balance card for wide angle? How far to hold it in front of the lens, angle down to coral or up to the surface?
So I angled the white balance card in the direction that I am shooting, because that's the direction of the ambient light. You'll have two different settings if you're shooting up towards the sun and then down towards the reef. So I will do that, and you're going to have to experiment with the specific camera, because generally you will take a still photo. It depends if you're doing, instant white balance, the 2-button push white balance on your camera. Generally arm's length should be good. I try to, in my mind, fill the frame as much as possible with the card, but while also getting the camera to focus. Sometimes it won't want to focus on it. So you want to get it in relatively sharp focus. To sometimes holding it at arm's length, if that's what I have to do. So really take experimentation with your specific camera. If you do have to take the picture of it and then load it into the camera, you've got a few more steps to then set the manual white balance versus if it's one press white balance. But yeah, as much of the frame as you can fill with the white balance card is going to be ideal.
All right, and now another one from Pam, but a different Pam. Pam from Chicago. Should I practice my underwater photography at home with my camera in or out of the housing?
Yeah, so we touched on it briefly. I would say practice your photography with the camera just in your hands. It doesn't need to be in your housing. Just work on that, because you want to spend a lot more time doing that, work on shooting everything we discussed. But then also a little bit, not as much, put the camera in the housing and practice doing some of the things you just practiced. So practice, all right, I want to change my aperture from f3.5 to f6.3. Which way do I spin that dial on the back of the camera? Or which way do I spin the dial? And make sure you have all of those things down. Okay, I shot that image, now let me review. So for the most part, out of the housing, but when you're talking about building specific muscle memory and trying to get fast at these things, then pop it into the housing. But it's not going to hurt the housing to practice with the camera in it.
Okay, next one from Lloyd. Are you suggesting all shooting with tripod for practice? Tripod, I think he meant tripod.
Tripod, yeah. So anything you want. Yeah. For the shots I showed in this video, most of those were shot on my tripod because I have one. In the video I made about the same topic, practicing at home, I put the camera for that regulator photo, I put it on top of my SPG, and I used my SPG on the carpet as my tripod. You could use books, you could use boxes, you could use anything you have on hand, even a sweater, just to create a tripod for your camera. So when you're indoors, what happens is you don't have a lot of natural light, so you're going to have to use a higher ISO and a slower shutter speed, or just a very slow shutter speed, which means you can't handhold the camera anymore. So you want to stabilize it in whatever method you can. So anything that gets the camera pointed at the subject that doesn't move is great. So definitely use that to practice.
Okay, and now one from Mark. How can I get good bokeh with black backgrounds?
So black backgrounds are going to be more a result of two things. So when you're shooting macro, I'm assuming. So one, it is going to be a result of your shutter speed. So for a black background, shoot at a faster shutter speed. If you have an interchangeable lens camera, usually 1/200th or 1/250th of a second is good. If you're on a compact, 1/500th of a second. Note that a lot of mirrorless and DSLRs have a maximum sync speed with your strobes. So never go above that maximum sync speed, but you can shoot at that maximum sync speed. So one is fast shutter speed. Two is make sure there's something behind your subject. If you have a subject that has something right behind it, just a few centimeters behind it, odds are high that you're going to illuminate what is behind the subject just because it's so close, unless you have really tight strobe positioning. So look for a subject that is on top of a piece of the reef, it's on top of a coral, it's on top of something that has open water behind it, because that open water is what's going to help create that black background. That's one of the reasons why you see snoots so popular these days, is because it allows you to create a black background with the subject that's on the sand, where it's really, really hard to make the subject, you're not going to move a subject from the sand to the top of the reef to create a black background. So you're stuck with the sand. So how do you get rid of the sand? A snoot. So basically look for those two things: speed, fast shutter speed, and open water behind your subject.
All right, and then the next one is from Debbie. What did Brent mean by manual photo app for our phones?
Oh yeah, sorry. So your phone generally shoots an automatic, but there are a number of apps, whether it's iOS or Android on your cell phone, that will allow you to adjust those camera settings manually. So they're fun. I can't tell you the best ones off the top of my head, but if you did want to get creative and use manual settings with your mobile phone, you could do that just by going to the App Store and looking for different photo apps. And you could adjust the settings manually through those apps.
Okay, and one from Bill. I always shoot raw. Are there times where I should really be shooting a different priority?
You should always be shooting raw. The only time I would not shoot raw is for camera reviews, when I want to get a JPEG out of camera, just to do a full-on comparison with JPEGs. But in terms of priority, that's a bit of a different question. I shoot full manual with the in RAW for any time I'm using a strobe. The exception would be if I'm shooting ambient light with something like a whale shark or whales or dolphins, then I might be shooting in an aperture priority or a time value or shutter priority. I'm basically picking one exposure variable, or two because of the ISO, and I'm letting the camera determine that third one.
All right, next one is from Alicia. I recently added a Fine light ring to improve my macro. It has the ability to strobe, but only at 3800 lumens,
Yes.
or stay at constant light. Do you recommend using the strobe's effect or stick with constant light? Hold on. If I stick with the light ring, will wide angle be out of the question?
So basically, the ring light is designed to be used for very close macro only, and not necessarily for wide angle. So if you're shooting wide angle, just turn it off. The ring light is only going to be effective up to several centimeters, like that far away. The best results are going to be when you're within this type of range of the subject. Definitely use a strobe. It's going to be bright. It does a pre-flash, so I believe it's automatic. It's like a TTL setting, so it should flash the proper amount to expose the image. 3800 lumens is going to be a lot brighter than the 1000 lumen constant light. So by all means, try with the flash. But definitely the best results I've seen are when you're very, very close to the subject. And you also want to find a subject without distracting things around it. So if you can find a subject that stands out that you can get close to, leave that strobe on, and you're going to get the best results with the ring light.
Cool. And then the next one is from Lloyd. Do you ever shoot manual focus with macro?
So here, this goes back to my comment on back button focus, where I never shoot manual focus with macro, but I do cheat manual, which I think is way better. Not that I'm endorsing cheating, but you know what I mean. So basically, I will have the camera in back button focus, which means I push my back button, and which is right here with my thumb, and I use that to focus. And anytime I'm pressing that back button focus, the camera is focusing, but as soon as I stop pushing it, my thumb is off the camera. Now the camera is in manual focus. It will not focus even if I push the shutter. I can do this all day and the focus won't change. So then what I can do is I can use my back button focus. I'm going to coach the autofocus to get where I want it. And then maybe I'll rock back and forth with the camera in manual focus, and then I'll just shoot the shutter without activating the autofocus drive. So in my mind, I don't need to be twisting anything when I can just rock back and forth slightly once I've zeroed it in very close with my automatic focus, because then it's the best of both worlds. So hope that answers that.
Okay, next one is from Daniel. Question with back button focus. There you go, another one.
Okay.
How often do you refocus on a given subject composition?
So first, I have a full back button focus video on my YouTube channel and website. So guys, go hunt that down, check it out with a written tutorial too. for more in-depth info. But basically refocus with back button focus before every shot. Especially when you're shooting macro. If your camera port from subject changes, you're this far away from the subject and you review your image, you come back in to shoot and now you're this far away from the subject, you're going to be way out of focus. You know, a little change this big is going to create all the difference. For wide angle, you've got a lot more tolerance there too, but I still keep that back button focus down before every shot just to make sure it's sharp. One of the things you do with back button focus is you use continuous autofocus and not single back button focus. So what you can do is hold the back button focus down and keep shooting. So my autofocus is constantly tracking the subject as I keep shooting the shots. And by doing that, it's constantly keeping the subject in focus as I shoot each frame.
All right, and then we've got one from Alice. I have an Olympus TG5 with strobe. Should I set the dial to P or A?
It depends what you are shooting. So P is going to be P for professional, but it's a program mode that allows you to shoot great photos in full automatic. Aperture mode is really nice because that is what's going to give you that control of the depth of field. The TG6 or TG5 gives you a few different apertures to choose from. So if you want to shoot down at f2, you're going to have very shallow depth of field for more of a creative effect on your macro photos. If you go to, I think it's f11, now you're going to have a lot of depth of field. So it's going to be a different creative effect for your macro photos. So I would say shoot in that A mode and work with the creative effects there. The camera will do the rest. All you're doing is choosing that aperture, and then the rest will happen. The camera does that thinking for you. And definitely try out microscope mode in all the TG cameras. It is fantastic for macro photos.
Cool, a couple more. Gino, what is a focus light?
Gino, okay, so a focus light is a little light that you mount on the top of your underwater camera housing. It is basically a dive torch, but what it does is it lights the subject you're trying to focus on. So you don't want to have it in your hands because then you're trying to do two things. And if you have two things in your hands, now you're not a safe diver. You want to be able to control your BCD or have a reef stick you can put down on the ground. Always have one hand free. So the focus light will be mounted to the camera and it allows you to see very brightly what the subject is. Imagine you're shooting a macro subject underneath a ledge at night. It's pitch black down there. You have that focus light. One, you can see. Two, your camera can see the subject, so the autofocus can work. Fantastic accessory for macro shooting. A lot of housings have a cold shoe mount and a way to mount the focus light on top of the housing. If your housing doesn't have that and you have a handle or arm, there are ways to mount the focus light to that handle and arm through mounts and things like that. So great accessory. 1,000 lumens is all you need. Very affordable. Must have if you're a macro diver.
And last question from Jason. Do you have a basic class for Sea Life DC2000? I'm new to this and have this camera.
Yeah, so at Atlantis, we do not have a formal class for the DC2000. I also don't do specific classes for that. I actually do one-on-one photo workshops. So if you want to talk more about the DC2000 and getting a big kickoff to using the camera, you should have my email address on the reservation confirmation. Hopefully, Ronnie, maybe you can put my email address in the chat now.
I'll do that right now.
Okay. And feel free to email me there and we can talk about that. Again, with Atlantis too, we have a number of different photo pros and professionals. I'm doing workshops year round and we'll be getting together a list of all those folks so we can help promote their workshops to really learn in depth on these cameras. Hopefully I'll be doing one next year too. Just need to put that on the books. So yeah, please feel free to reach out anytime.
Super. I think this is the end of our questions.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Yeah, this has been fun for me too. Hopefully you guys learned a lot, stay pumped, and are ready to get in the water when it's safe to do so. Ronnie, huge thanks. Couldn't do this without you. Good teamwork. I was happy to help on your webinar and will help on the next one next Tuesday at 11 Pacific and 2 Eastern.
Yeah, guys, so please do join us next week. We're going to have a webinar about Apo Island, which is the longest lasting marine protected area in the Philippines. And we're going to talk about the marine conservation efforts in the Philippines, how it started and how it continues and what you can do to be part of it. You can go to our website on our website under Guest Corner. There is a submenu called Webinars where you can find all the information. And we are extremely happy to be helping you to pass along time dreaming about bubbles in these crazy times.
Absolutely. And as always, if you have any questions about Atlantis and what we're doing, photo facilities, all of that too, reach out to me anytime, reach out to any of us anytime, and we're happy to answer those questions. So yeah, big thank you guys. Appreciate you joining, and we look forward to seeing you on the next 2 and maybe more webinars. So have a good rest of your Tuesday and a good rest of your week. We'll see you later.